Well, welcome to this SEBA podcast. I don't think we've got a name for it, but maybe we'll call it SEBA Cast. It's the very first one that I've done. I don't think SEBA have ever done a podcast before, but I'm absolutely delighted that the very first podcast that we do together is with Andy Hickford. Andy, welcome to SEBA podcast, SEBA Cast, whatever we call it. How are you?
Thanks, Joth. It's good to be here. I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well and flattered to be the first podcast guest.
Actually, a guy called Rob Stevens may take issue with me because I think he may have done one or two podcasts, but whether they're SEBA podcasts, I'm not sure. But you're certainly the first one that I've done with SEBA. So it's good to have you on board. And thank you, Andy, for being willing to come and share with us at our Ministers' Conference in the end of February into March. We're really looking forward to that. So thank you ever so much. How are things with you at this time?
So I'm in a really interesting stage of my life. So I've been in pastoral ministry for 37 years in 3 churches. I started at Stopsey Baptist Church in Luton and then went to Worthing and worked in Maybury Community Church for 23 years. And then for the last 4 years, I've been at Upton Vale Baptist Church in Torquay. And on the 31st of December, that comes to an end. And my wife and I are beginning a new ministry called Jubilee Leadership, which is about supporting and resourcing Christian leaders. So it's a really interesting phase of our lives. You know, everything that has been familiar for 37 years is beginning to kind of fade back into the distance. So we are on sabbatical at the moment. We're renovating a property in which we're going to live. We're starting a charity and beginning to grow a ministry. So it's really exciting. Yeah.
I just think it's fascinating that as I was kind of thinking about who to invite, you know, I remembered you thought, I wonder if Andy would come and speak. And then discovered that you're in this transition from one ministry into another, and actually very much focused on supporting and also encouraging new leaders as well, training new leaders. You've been in ministry during COVID. As we come to the Ministers' Conference, we recognise that this this was not post-COVID, but post-lockdown that we faced as ministers has been really challenging, and many ministers, you know, feel quite worn out by the journey. So it'd be good to hear a little bit. I mean, what was your journey like at Upton Vale? Because you would have been at Upton Vale during lockdown. Yeah, was it tough?
No, it's an absolute breeze. Not a problem at all. Yeah, right. I mean, I found it with 30 plus years experience immensely challenging, and I really am very grateful that I was leading a local church at that time, because I think that if I had gone into leadership development work earlier, pre-COVID, I think it was such a game changer, and actually continues to be, because we are not out of the woods yet. We are in this recovery stage, which all the experts say goes on for longer and is actually as challenging as the intensity of lockdown. And that's certainly been our experience at UV. I think if we bring it slightly into a slightly bigger context, I think local church ministry right now is enormously challenging. You've got the geopolitical situation, you've got post-Brexit, you've got the whole post-pandemic, you've got the whole Ukraine war, energy crisis, rich, poor gap getting bigger and bigger. We're ministering in that environment. You've got the local church post-COVID, where volunteers are much less than they were before, where you've got attendance patterns, which are seem to have just become even more accentuated in terms of people coming less often, and that making it so difficult to get any sense of momentum and rhythm. And then, of course, you've got your whole congregation who measures faithfulness by getting back to what we were doing pre-COVID. and number one, we don't have the volunteers for it. And number two, it's not like it was that great before. We weren't seeing the world come to Christ. Why would we want to go back to that kind of model? And so there's this huge opportunity to think afresh, but it doesn't feel like anybody's got the emotional reserves to do it. And then that just leaves your ministers more and more isolated, more and more weary, feeling like all the outputs are exceeding the inputs. And that will be the context for many who gather at the conference. I don't want to sound like the Grim Reaper, but it really is an enormously challenging, pivotal moment in the life of the church in the West. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
And that's partly why we've called it, rest and vision, because we recognize that many ministers need rest in God. And we'll come back and chat about what that kind of means for you and why we put those two words together. But let me just get a little bit more information about you, the person, Andy Hickford. I mean, I've known you for many years. I remember you coming to speak in Essex. I don't know if you remember, at Southend for an event we did with Vis-a-Vis. So you've
years ago.
You've been around. Well, we've both been around for years and years, it seems like.
Yeah, no, speak for yourself.
Yeah. I think you've been around a little bit longer than I have, actually, Andy. But I don't know a huge amount about your personal life, your family. Tell us a little bit about your family life and who you're married to.
Okay, so I'm married to Keris. We have 3 grown-up kids. Who all live back in Worthing, where we were in ministry for 23 years. And that's a rich thing. They're all in different ways connected with the church. We enjoy doing adult family life, really. It's great having 3 grown-up kids. So I was brought up in Surrey and became a Christian when I was 16. Had the privilege of being brought up in a Christian home. Studied at London Bible College, and then didn't think that God was calling me directly into ministry, and wanted to avoid going into ministry for as long as possible. So I had this really, really interesting call to go and work at Stopsey Baptist Church with Steve Gorkroger. Didn't want to go into ministry straight away, because I'd gone straight from sixth form to Bible college. So I worked for a year as a store detective in Luton, which at the time had the 3rd highest crime rate per head of the population, only after Brixton and Toxteth. So I didn't want anybody to say I didn't have an experience of the big bad world. So I basically arrested people for a living for a year. And spent 70% of my time bored out of my head, 25% of my time very, very exhilarated, and 5% of my time absolutely terrified for a year. But it was a great experience, and then became Steve's youth worker, and we did 10 years together after that. So it's just a
so Andy, what do you do? What's your favorite pastime when you've got a bit of spare time?
I mentioned earlier that I'm involved in renovating a property. So this cottage in its oldest part is probably 200 years old. It's got walls that are about a meter thick, stone and cob, and it used to belong to my grandparents. And through a whole amazing, miraculous journey, we now own it without a mortgage, and we're renovating it to be the basis of this new ministry, Jubilee Leadership. So for years I have walked around this increasingly decrepit, dilapidated building thinking, you could do this and you could do that. And we've got a great builder who's working with us, and one of the things I enjoy the most at the moment is clambering over this roof or climbing up the scaffold or moving block. I mean, I am very low on skill level when it comes to this stuff, but I'm very enthusiastic. So most of my spare time is spent there at the moment, and it's off grid. So it's a well-fed property. There's no gas. The only thing we got is electricity coming in. So it's all those. How do we do the kind of energy supply for the future and thinking through all that stuff. That's very life-giving for me at the moment.
I guess that doesn't sound like a pastime. That sounds like a full time,
Yeah, maybe because it's so different to the how I've spent my career that I find it so life-giving. But no, other than that, I still run. I enjoy running, and I love watching sport. I get to go fishing about once a year. I'm hoping that will improve in the future. Yeah, those are the kind of things. I'm an activist and I'm an outdoor person. So, walking, exploring the country, British wildlife, all that sort of stuff. That floats my boat.
Okay. And when you and Kara sit down to have a takeaway, what's your go-to takeaway?
Indian.
Oh
yeah. But the trouble is, our son-in-law is Indian. So we met Janay when I was out in Calcutta speaking, and he was my translator. And he was 18 at the time. Fantastic guy. He was brought up in the slums of Calcutta. His dad died when he was young. He was the breadwinner by 14. But compassion gave him an education, sponsored child.
Wow.
Turns out he was brilliant. And came to the UK to do a master's degree in international business. My daughter had been out there the previous year teaching for 6 months. And when he came over to the UK, he phoned me one day and he said, would you mind if I called your daughter from time to time? And 2 years later, we had a double wedding celebration, one in Calcutta, which was just my daughter, imagine this, through the streets of Calcutta, walking with her two brothers holding up her English white wedding dress, going through all the chaos to walk to the wedding and stopping for chai on the way. It was an amazing cultural experience, and then getting married here too. So the point is that our bar about Indian food has gone up several notches.
Yeah.
He is a brilliant cook amongst many other things. So but we enjoy Indian.
Well, it's one of the downsides. I mean, we love an Indian, but when you meet an Indian family and they invite you around for a proper Indian, I mean, the bar goes way up, and you think it's never the same. It's never the same.
Yeah.
You have a dilemma now. What about pets? Are you a cat man or a dog man or something else?
Dog every time. We had a dog when the kids were growing up, and that was 12 years of some great family memories, and just this dog appears in more photos than I do actually. But so there's a conversation that's happening between my wife and I about whether we're going to get another dog, and so I don't want to say anything on this podcast which would fuel her argument for getting one earlier than I want to, but no, dog every time.
Great. I guess that fits with being outside and walking and enjoying the countryside and all that kind of thing. Difficult to do that with a cat.
Difficult to do anything with a cat.
Well, we need to be careful because there'll be cat lovers out there that are listening, so we don't want to turn them off too soon.
I wouldn't worry too much about that.
I'm with you with the dog. I tend to lean towards dogs. I'm not so keen on cats, but I'm not sure what that says about me. Let's go back to your journey of ministry, because I remember you being in youth ministry at Stopsley, and you mentioned that. But then you moved to Worthing, wasn't it? And you took on a church down in Worthing. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd just written an article on why I intended to be a youth minister for life. And then we had our first sabbatical and went off to the Highlands of Scotland. We had 2 children, they were really young. So I'd get up early and do some study, and I read voraciously, and it was just such a life-giving thing to be on the side of this sea lock in the Highlands and just reading and praying and thinking about the future. And about 2 months in, Keris sat me down and she said, Andy, we had a deal that I was marrying a youth minister, but everything you're getting excited about on this sabbatical has nothing to do with youth ministry. And it was the first moment I realized that actually, because I'd been reading the missionaries, I've been reading the missiologists, I've been thinking about how do we do cross-cultural mission, because the kids I was working with in Luton were 1,000,000 miles away from the church culture I was part of. they were not 14 like I was 14. The world had changed, and I had to think about, okay, so how are we going to do this? How are we going to communicate Jesus to these people? And that just propelled me into a wider framework, which I realized you can't do youth work in isolation. You've got to do it in the context of the wider church. And so I wrote a book called Essential Youth, which was basically about how youth work is on the prophetic edge of church life. It helps us to stay ahead of the curve in terms of cultural engagement.
Yeah.
And so I realized that actually that calling in my life was changing. So I went to Maybridge. Maybridge was a really small member of the FIEC at that moment. And I'd had a very clear calling to ministry. I'd had a very clear calling to Stopsley. And then it seemed like I had a number of choices of where I could go. And I basically sat down with my prayer partners, and they said, look, which church is the most open to the vision that you want to kind of bring of engaging with post-Christian culture? And so Maybridge fitted that bill. And so that was the journey we undertook for the next 23 years.
Was it 23 years, was it?
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was that long. I knew it was a long ministry in a sense, but 23 years is a good amount of time.
I think longevity in a place is essential if you really do want to bring about lasting cultural change. I remember speaking at a conference of all the Methodist ministers in North and Southern Ireland, and they were just saying, the system moves them on every 3 to 5 years or whatever it is. I can't remember what it is now. And they were recognizing that that's very costly for their family, particularly their children, but it's also really costly for the church, because nobody really trusts you with change if you're not going to stay around to carry the consequences of it. When I got to Upton Vale, there was this wonderful lady who shook my hand on the first day, and I said, I'm delighted to meet you. And she just eyeballed me and she said, my mother said to me, Jan, ministers come, ministers go, and we stay. She said, it's great to meet you, and walked out the door. And you just say, okay, you're open to change. Now, she turned out to be a complete star, but it was
great.
that mindset that is around traditional churches. They've seen too many people come and go and not live with the consequences of their changes.
Yeah.
So
23 years, then that came to an end. So that I mean, surely God was speaking to you, moving you. Things must have happened at that point to kind of prompt you to think, well, is God moving me on at this point?
Yeah. And it was really costly as well, because we were very, very happy there and had a wonderful team and just a rich experience. But basically, Keris and I had another sabbatical, and we went away to pray, and we were in our mid-50s saying, Lord, what does the next 10 years look like? And we realized that the place where we could have most leverage and most impact in the kingdom was working with Christian leaders. And that was where this vision for Jubilee leadership at the cottage, or based at the cottage, began to emerge. And then it was just a succession of ridiculous God things that, just came into one after the other, where in the end, even the church, even our closest friends in the church who didn't want us to go were saying, we give up. We can't argue with God here. The kind of thing where, we had just realized that if this was going to work, we would need a job in the area for a few years. And completely out of the blue, Upton Vale rang me and said they wanted me to be their next senior minister. We didn't have any money to purchase the cottage, and someone came forward and said, we'll help you buy it mortgage free. There were just so many things that came into place that I'm absolutely rooted in this idea that this is what faithfulness looks like for us. It was very exciting, but costly.
Yeah. And Andy, we're just so delighted that actually in this journey that God's taken you on and kind of filled your heart and your compassion about leadership, that you're going to come and serve us for a few days in our conference. And we've titled it Rest and Vision. And I remember saying that to you and saying, when we were chatting on the phone, I think you were on the roof of your cottage at the time, because I could hear the wind kind of whistling around. And saying to you at the time, they're kind of two interesting words that often we don't put together. Vision, rest and vision, but you got quite excited by that kind of title.
Yeah, I did, not only because I think it's what we have to find in this season in church in the West, but also because of my personal journey of ministry and leadership, where for me there is this inextricable link between slowing and knowing, that you really do have to go down a gear to pull stronger. I'll see how many other cliches I can bring into this conversation, but no, it's such a deep thing for me, and I struggle with it so much. It doesn't come naturally. But if you can, many of the people who are listening to this or watching this will have seen this before, but, if you can imagine a dial, most ministers are sailing very close to the wind in terms of their emotional, psychological, spiritual capacity. And you don't hear God there. You just survive there. You don't thrive. You've got to come back and get the dial you don't want it lethargic right over the other side, because you need to be doing stuff. But if you're just over that 50-55%, that's the sweet spot where there is activity, there is rhythm, there is rest, and that's where the new things of God are birthed. And I basically I became unwell in 2004 after years of overworking, and I discovered a incredibly life-giving rhythm of 4 times a year. There were other things, but the core of it was 4 times a year I would go away to a monastery for 48 hours and be in a hut in the grounds. And my journey and my ministry changed in that hut, basically, because I discovered this inextricable link between rest and vision. And the horrible trap we got into in this point post-COVID is that because there are less volunteers around, you've got the faithful people of Jesus working harder and harder to keep going those things which don't have the resources that they had back in the 1980s and 90s. And they feel that that's what faithfulness to Jesus looks like. And actually it's not. If lockdown was not a massive pattern interruption into the way we think and act as a church, if it wasn't, as Lynn Green was so brilliant at saying during the lockdown, if it isn't this new opportunity, forget the former things, I'm doing a new thing. What I want to explore at our time together is not just the relationship between rest and vision, but how do we help the church embrace this new day? Because it's not supposed to go back to the way it was.
And that'd be fantastic, Andy, because I think for many of us, that will just resonate where we are and what we're learning. So many of us are learning about this, stopping and allowing God to do the things that need to be done, and rather than coming up with our great plans and ideas and all our energy and expectations on ourselves as if we're going to kind of solve the issue.
Yeah,
God knows, doesn't he? God knows, and we just got to get in tune with him.
Yeah. And the waiting is dreadful. It is it is a nightmare. You've got all these clamoring voices. We've got our own drivers within us, which are, what did Paul say? We all have passions at war against our soul. And so we're coping with voices, external and internal, and trying to do this thing when we're weary, And what does this moment in history require of us as leaders? So I'll be talking about, refreshing the familiar and birthing the new. I think but it will be rooted in the pragmatism of, but local church life is tough. I've been in the role a long time, but just this last week, I've just realized that actually now I'm on sabbatical and not going back. There's a lightness to, there's that weight of responsibility that the scriptures talk about. I didn't even realize it was there, but it certainly was. And so, I'm not coming as an expert, but I'm coming as one beggar telling another where to find bread, but, and with a massive dose of compassion for guys who, find themselves called for this season. We don't know where it's going and what it's going to look like. So, it'll be an enormous privilege to be with my brothers and sisters.
And Andy, we're really grateful. And one of the reasons we're delighted you're coming is because we know you've walked the journey. You've been there in local ministry. You know what it's like, and you know what it's like in recent years to carry the church, or not carry it, but journey with the church through that challenging period. So we're absolutely delighted, really looking forward to our time together, seeing what God says and does through you, but with us together. And we know it'll be very interactive because that's the kind of person that you are. And hopefully in that moment, those few days of rest, God might just instill something of his vision in us as we move forward into the future. So bless you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a tremendous value of just getting off site, of, coming away from our normal context. It lends itself to that, taking a step back and being able to look a little bit more objectively of what we get caught up in from the day to day, with the help of our brothers and sisters around us. So it could be a really rich time. I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. And Andy, thanks for being our very first guest on Seabercast. I don't think we'll be challenging newscast, but you never know.
Thanks, John. It's been a privilege.
God bless you.
God bless you.